Allow the vibrations to move in, within, and through you. Remember, be aware of your breath. I'm going to make a little bit of a sound right now. You heard it a lot from your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, if you knew her. Sounds like this. Just a beautiful, gentle shh. Okay, do that with me. Let's do that again. One more. Thank you. I forgot my rain stick, so now you just recreated that effect from several different angles at once. That was beautiful. We're actually going to add a sound to that, like this. Shong. Shong. You hear that sound? Shong. Can you say that? Shong. But we're going to tone it to the pitch of this bowl, like this. Just listen to the first one. Shong. Okay, let's get a beautiful breath in through the nose. Let's do that several times. One more. We're going to tone one word one time. Sounds a little different than you're used to in the West because we mispronounce pretty much everything. We quote Jesus with King James English that's only 500 years old and put it all over our billboards, not realizing that those words didn't exist when he was alive. But we're going to tone one word once like this. Amen. One big amen, okay? And then back to silence. You ready? How does that feel? You want to know what that word means? That's actually the primary Chinese word for holy or sacred. Xiong. Xiong. So, I'm going to reread actually what Arthur read. And since he said I was his favorite speaker, we didn't actually figure out a fee, like how much I owed you for that. We'll talk about it after. Bill always finds the coolest stuff, and I want to reread this because I don't want to give Bill too much credit, But it says, the luminous path of the Jesus Sutras when East met West. In China, the centuries from about 600 AD to 1300 AD, us scholarly types call that CE, which means Common Era. And AD does not mean after death. Is often called, well, kind of it does, but not really, is often called the Golden Age of China. In 635 AD, a Christian Nestorian missionary named Alupin arrived in China and was so well received by the ruler Taizong that Christianity bloomed in China for hundreds of years. Taizong arranged for the Bible to be translated into their language and disseminated all over China, and Alupin was appointed bishop. On June 25th, 1900, a small cave was found stuffed to the ceiling with textiles, paintings, artifacts, and manuscripts, including the Jesus Sutras. Of the 50,000 manuscripts in what is called the library cave, only 8 of them make up what are called the Jesus Sutras, which date to around 635 AD, the year of the missionary Alapin's arrival in China. These are astoundingly biblical, with some Buddhist and Taoist thought and phrases interwoven within the sutras. And he got that from earlychurchhistory.org. There's something about the Jesus Sutras that's spoken to me for quite a few years now. And the thought that came to my mind over the past few days is it's as if, as humans, humanity has become so smart, so shrewd, so self-righteously discerning. But the question I often have is, can we be wise? Because there's a big difference between, as an example of what many would say, intellect and intelligence. And there's something about the Jesus Sutras, they're so freaking simple, and they're so clear, yet a lot of them are really in, it's almost like parables. Yeshua spoke in parables often. The great thing about a parable is you can take it into multiple languages, and as long as you get the story right, you can mess all the words up. You can even mess up the names of all the people, but the message gets across. Sutra actually comes from a Sanskrit word. It's one of the Sanskrit words that mean thread. Nice little thing there, but we're going to look at some of that. So actually, I wanted to say quickly that there's not a lot of resources. If you want to read about the Jesus Sutras, there's not a lot of resources. The best one, in my opinion, I think probably in everybody's opinion, is a book called the Jesus Sutras. If you want to write it down, easy to remember, from Martin Palmer. I'll talk about Martin in a little while. Another good one, which is one I actually brought with me, The Lost Sutras of Jesus from Ray Reigert and the one and only Thomas More. Easy little read. There's not so much of the sutras in this, there's just little excerpts, but this is a neat little book about the history of it. You can find stuff online as well, but so they're really called the Jingzhao documents, which we'll get to. Let me give you a little bit of history. So in 635 of the Common Era AD, a small band of Persian missionaries in white robes, led by a monk named Alapin, brought Syriac Aramaic texts on a 3,000-mile journey along the Silk Road to the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an, which is now called Xi'an or Xi'an. Because that's what you do, right? When you have nothing else to do, you walk 3,000 miles with a few documents. It's a funny thing about Tai Zong, because he was actually quite the warmonger. But I want to give you a couple of quotes that he had about the Jesus Sutras. He said they were otherworldly, profound, and full of mystery. He called it the Luminous path or the Luminous religion. They were ultimately translated into Chinese. They were put into what's called the Imperial Library, which had over 200,000 volumes in it, rivaled that of Alexandria. It's a funny thing because when I think about Alexandria, maybe I was there, my heart kind of goes, ugh, at the thought of that burning up and that going down the way it did. We can only even imagine what's in there, kind of like the Vatican Library. So once in the Imperial Library, Marco Polo actually investigated them, but they ultimately ended up in a cave about 1,000 miles west of Xi'an, okay, where that was sealed in the year 1005. Something interesting happened to them, though, because I don't know, anybody here ever studied actual Christianity? I don't mean something you find in seminary. I mean the actual real history of Christianity. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but seriously, that you're not going to find out the truth of Christianity from the organizations representing it. It's kind of like this. Let me put it this way. I graduated high school in 1990, and it wasn't until a few years later that I realized that pretty much my entire American history book was made up of stuff that never happened. It was years before I realized that. All that stuff they were driving into my head was just made up stories that were made up by newspaper reporters that would write these sensational stories about the Crow heathens and the Sioux, all of the what was the words that they would use? Throw out some words they would use for the savages. There's the big one. Of course. Barbarians. Of course, they were so base they didn't even have a civilization. Funny, because now there's actually more Native Americans now than there was then. Kind of beautiful how that happens. And there was no such thing as A Last of the Mohicans, even though it was a great book and movie. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that they were writing these things so that they could get picked up on newswire as the precursor to the Associated Press to become rich and famous. They were making it up on the spot. And then in right around 1991 or 92, I read a book from D. Brown that I think was released the year I was born, 1972, called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it was about big, which there is no way when I was in school you could have got me to read a book. Like, of course, I have to do a book report on Einstein, so you take out a book that big and you read like a half page here and a half page over there and a couple of sentences over there. You copy it but change the words. Well, I didn't say any of that. He's probably not going to, he hasn't realized that yet. But I actually read it and I tore it apart. And I didn't tear it apart. But it really got to me. And it was the funny thing about Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is I was already studying Christianity when I was 7 years old. And even then, I knew that something was different. I knew that I don't really seek to have this come out as a judgment thing, but I could very clearly see at the age of 7 that the people that were teaching it to me and in a lot of cases forcing it upon me weren't really living it. And I'll say, we're going to end with some beautiful quotes from the Jesus Sutras, and there's one in there about that very thing where you sort of put out that you're following the beautiful path, and in reality, what's actually happening. And I picked that stuff up as a kid, and I kept being open and open and open. I got really deep into the Tao Te Ching, which was written by who? Lao Tzu. Does anybody know what that word means?
Tao Te Ching?
No, Lao Tzu.
Old teacher.
Old man, old sage, old teacher. That's all. As a matter of fact, a lot of people believe it wasn't one person, it was actually several people. The Jesus Sutras caught my eye. I think it's been about 12 years, 10 years. Someone that I did a lot of work with for many years, a dear soul named Albert LaChance. He's in my DVD if you've seen it before. The guy that looks like Santa Claus. He's on several of my CD programs. And he turned me on to the Jesus Sutras, and I went, wow, because it was a blend of early Christianity, Taoism, and Buddhism. And Buddhism was the other thing for me. When I was in my early 20s, I was that close to becoming ordained as a Buddhist monk. And it was one of the final meetings that we had, and they asked me that magic question. Are you running from anything? And I went, they said, when you enter into the Sangha, whatever it is that's within your heart is going to be laid out in the middle of the community, and we're all going to look at it. And we're all going to breathe into that, meditate upon it. And I went, and I wasn't really running away from something per se, but I was looking for some kind of peace out there, if you understand what I'm saying, rather than finding it right here. So in view of that, I want to give you some of the ideas. This is some of the stuff that's in the Jesus Sutras in terms of content. This one, the first one, is quite revolutionary. Actually, it's not if you study actual Christianity rather than what's presented. One of the things in the sutras is that Mary was the mother of a man, not a god. Another one. Jesus was a sage of great wisdom, not an infallible porcelain doll. Promoted nonviolence to all life forms. That's Buddhism there, too. Very much so. When I think of that, I often think of Richard Gere, who, of course, good friend of the Dalai Lama. But Richard Gere was filming a movie called Runaway Bride, actually, with Julia Roberts, which was not necessarily a sequel to Pretty Woman. It was a whole different kind of thing. But there was a fly, I believe it was a fly, that was on set when they were trying to film a scene at a little cafe. And he actually had them stop filming and put his cup down, captured the fly. Somebody wanted to swat it to get it off camera, put it across onto his hand, took it outside, and let it fly away. That's Buddhism. Us Americans, kind of common. Spoke of karma and reincarnation. I'll say this. Karma is in the Bible. Reincarnation is in the Bible. But it doesn't look like what you would think it would look like. I had this interesting experience a few weeks ago where I was prepping a talk for, I think it was actually for Atlanta, and I ended up not using it in that particular setting. And it was some of Paul's letters, and it was from Philippians too. And I was flabbergasted? Is that a word? That's a word. It just sounds awful. Awful means full of all. 100 years ago, if you look in the literature, the word awful meant full of all, okay? It's funny how we mess those things up. Terrific. We've screwed our words up really bad. Terrific, which means what? Full of terror. Actually, well, it means wonderful now, yeah. And it's funny how people always say the King James Bible is a literal translation. It's not a literal translation, because I'm sitting here with a Greek lexicon Bible, a Greek dictionary, 2 different Aramaic Bibles, several different English, King James, New King James, 1611 King James, and I'm looking at how off the King James was even from the Greek. Sometimes entirely different meanings. So I'm not implying that happened, and it's still there in Christianity with all the mistranslations. But so Jesus saved us from sin, not from sin, but from the wheel of reincarnation, from the endless cycle of birth and death. So what we're going to do, would you like to hear some of them? The Jesus Sutras? Let me tell you a little bit about them quickly first. So it was mentioned in that I read about in 1900, while overseeing workmen were clearing sand from a temple cave, a priest discovered an adjoining room sealed with bricks and other materials. The hidden entranceway had been plastered over and then painted with a mural. The men burst through the plaster, tore bricks and debris from the chamber mouth, and peered into the forgotten lair. It's like Indiana Jones, isn't it? As a later observer described the scene, heaped up in layers, there appeared in the dim light of the priest's little lamp a solid mass of manuscript bundles rising to a height of nearly 10 feet. And I've seen small photos of some of the smaller bundles, and they literally were stacked one on top of each other. The scrolls and other documents numbered as many as 50,000. There were silk paintings, exquisite embroideries, and other priceless textiles, as well as books printed 600 years before the Gutenberg Bible. Gutenberg's one of those Bibles that King James borrowed from for the King James Bible that was supposedly a completely original Bible. The Tyndale was another. Historians eventually determined that the library cave was sealed around 1005 of the Common Era, AD. The monk's discovery was, in the words of the J. Paul Getty Museum, one of the most important finds in the entire history of archaeology. And you've heard about it before, right? No. Nope. It's kind of the way it works when you've got religious spin doctors trying to suppress things like that. The Jesus Sutras, representing a small part of the library, became as widely dispersed as the Buddhist texts within that cave. It was not until the 1930s that they were translated into English. After resting intact behind a decorated wall for 9 centuries, they were, within a few years of R.L. Stein's expedition, scattered across the world from Paris to Tokyo. Even when the track resurfaces with the discovery of the secret cave in 1900, it was soon swept into obscurity once more. The next piece of evidence to emerge did not surface until 1933, when 4 Chinese scholars went searching for a monastery built by Emperor Taizong for the Xian monks. Combing the countryside south of Xian, They entered, or they found a white tower. It's amazing because they were coming down a hill. They'd been looking for days, just like Indiana Jones, encountered a white tower, which was actually, everything was grown in around it. There remained by this tower a monastery in ruin, and to our satisfaction, we were told that this ruin was the remnant of the monastery. It was a lucky hit we made. Like the ancient scrolls themselves, the ruins were quickly forgotten as China was ravaged, first by World War II and then the communist takeover. It would not be until 1998, almost a century after Abbot Wang cleared sand from a cave, that the White Tower would emerge again, and that was through the work of Martin Palmer. So that's pretty cool stuff. Very mindfully. So what does that mean? It's on the heart chakra. That means that according to Eastern science and philosophy, this tone, which is slightly north of F, slightly south of F sharp, resonates almost like putting sand on a drum head and you put it near a speaker and it starts to shake. And the funny thing is, if you look into something called cymatics, as those sand crystals start to gather into these amazing sacred geometrical formations, what you see isn't the tone, what you see is the silence. Because the vibrations keep the sand moving. They rest where it's not vibrating. And it just happens to create things like the Eye of Ra. It just happens to create things like the flower of life. Think about that, or the tree of life. Bring in another octave tone there. Don't go too far with paradigm. So, this is from the Jesus Sutras. There are 10 methods. Can you hear me clearly over this? There are 10 methods or paths for contemplating the manifest world that can lead us to true happiness and self-actualization. The first path is to realize that upon birth, people immediately begin to grow old, and eventually they die. The world is like an inn where you visit temporarily. None of the beds or furniture are really yours. We will all be gone soon, for no one can stay long in an inn. The second is to observe how our friends and loved ones are taken from us, just as the leaves fall from a tree. Wind and winter arrive, and the leaves are gone. Big breath. Raymond's smile is like right here for me right now, by the way. You know, a big friend of the center here. You know, every time I would come, oh, Dale, I love you so much. I was like, that's why I love you, because you love me. I didn't say that, but Raymond was amazing. But the third path is to recognize that the manifest world is a place where the success of the mighty and the prosperity of the wealthy will never last. They are like the moon at night. The full moon shines on everything until clouds appear. Or the full moon changes into the new moon and its light is gone. We're going to move up to the throat chakra. So this tone is the resonant tone of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid at Giza. It's this little walkway chamber just off from the center, just above the middle. And they say that you can tone any other sound, any other pitch in that chamber, nothing much happens. But when you hit this pitch, that of the throat chakra, the room lights up. They say it sparks. They say you can hear hundreds of voices coming back at you. Interesting thing. The fourth path is to consider the world as a place where people steal things from others that they believe are valuable, but which eventually harm them instead. They are like moths attracted to a light who ultimately dive into the flame. That brings to mind for me the quote from one of my 30 or so translations of the Tao Te Ching, where it says to be mindful when handling the master craftsman's tools, lest you cut your hand. I'll say that's something very common with Aramaic. There's a lot of people representing themselves as Aramaic know-it-alls that don't really know anything about it. And they've used it as some sort of, like, I'm not sure, advertising tool. The fifth is to contemplate the world as a place where the wealthy exhaust both their body and spirit, accumulating treasures that cannot help them in the end. They are like small jars that cannot hold the rivers, the lakes, and the seas that they covet. The sixth asks you to look at the world as a place where people dally in sexual activities that bring them unhappiness instead of true fulfillment. They are like a tree infected with insects that erodes its strength away and eats at its core until it dries up and breaks. Third eye, we're moving up another chakra. Whew, it's getting stronger. The seventh is to think of the world as a place where people indulge in alcohol until they are so drunk and bewildered that they do not know right from wrong. They are like a clear spring pool whose mirror-like surface perfectly reflects everything, but it becomes muddy and the images vanish, leaving filthy water in which nothing can be seen. The eighth calls for thinking of the world as a place where people act as if life were a game. They sit around wasting the hours of the day and wearing out their vital spirit. They are like a madman who imagines he has seen flowers, walks around all night trying to find them again. In the end, as the sun rises, he is exhausted and he has seen nothing. Crown chakra. The ninth is to think of the world as a place where people go from religion to religion. You've never done that before. Looking for truth, but find only confusion. They are like a skilled craftsman who carves an ox and paints it until the statue resembles the real thing. When he tries to use it to plow his field, though, the ox is good for nothing. That's a good one. So here's the final one. This one puts a little bit of a lump in my throat, but the 10th is to contemplate the manifest world as a place where people seem to be following these principles, but are actually deceiving themselves and helping no one. They are like an oyster that holds a brilliant pearl. A fisherman breaks the oyster to extract the pearl, and the oyster dies. The pearl looks beautiful, but the oyster is dead. So, welcome to the Jesus Sutras. I highly encourage you to get Thomas More's book with Ray Reichert called The Lost Sutras of Jesus. It's easy to get on Amazon for a few bucks. If you want to get Martin Palmer's book, in my opinion, one of the greatest spiritual treasures of the past 40, 50 years, you're going to have to hunt a little. You can get it on Amazon, but you're going to have to get it through a third-party vendor. You're going to have to pay a little bit extra for a book that comes dog-eared and has coffee stains on it, but that's okay. That's the kind of stuff fascinates me, how something that's so incredibly rich, like certain movies or certain pieces of music, books, whatever, don't get kept into circulation, etc. So we're going to bring this to a close. Very different from any talk I've ever given here. I'm not throwing out all kinds of Aramaic theology and everything, but I will say this. The thing about the Jesus Sutras that I really feel can wrap them up is a quote that I always use here, and I'm going to finish with this quote, and then we're going to tone one word. The quote is this from St. Francis of Assisi, and I did look into that. And coming from the Italian, the best that I can find is still in line with the way I've been presenting it to you, which is what you are looking for is what is looking. What you're looking for is what is looking. Think about that. The peace, the prosperity, the divine essence, the blessings, the grace, all of that you seek is your true nature. And we're just here in this world for a little time, like it said in that one sutra. We're just here almost essentially playing a part in a movie, but no one can stay forever in the inn. We're all going to go home eventually. One of the things that Stuart Wilde often said to me is, he said, Dale, it's like you're thrown down into a swimming pool, and it's full of like this sort of viscous jello. And that's what the physical world is, that manifest world, is being able to navigate these eternal realms while essentially locked in a pod of unconsciousness and not really being able to move with the maximum fluidity you'd be able to without your mortal coil, without the garment. Something really profound about that. So let's bring this to a close, toning one word, which is a word we toned earlier, just like this. Amen. Amen.